All right guys, welcome to the in-depth video for our production downhill frame. Finally, we're able to take the project from all the testing and all the frame revisions we've done over the past 2 years to being able to offer this frame for pre-sale to the public. And I'm just gonna go through all the spec, pretty much every decision that we made to arrive at this frame and give you our thoughts behind it. So this Wednesday, November 8th, we're opening the pre-orders for this frame. As it sits here with no shock is gonna be $3,950 US. That'll include a straight headset, the rear axle, derailleur hanger, and any hardware you need for the frame. We also have 3 shock options in addition to that, and I'll get into that at the end of the video. So this is the 8th refinement of the frame that we made. 10 if you include the 2 steel versions, and through that process of refining it each time, we were able to get every little bit of performance and reliability out of the frame, just being able to go back on each little part every time we made a new frame, taking what we learned, riding it, racing it, and living with it, and make it a little better. A process that we were able to do working locally with Frank that we may not have been able to do if we were working with a larger scale factory. So specs for the frame. Starting out, it's mixed wheel, 27.5 rear, 29 front. I committed to that since the beginning of the project based on other bikes that I test rode to get to my first prototype. And I think it has more advantages for downhill racing than might meet the eye. Generally, downhill tracks are steep. The biggest thing you notice is the clearance to the rear wheel. You can get your weight lower to the back over jumps when you're trying to scrub and stay low. In steeper sections, drops. Just really nice to have the clearance from your butt to the back wheel. So when you're running a 27.5 rear wheel, your rear axle is actually lower to the ground than on a 29-inch wheel. So with the same main pivot height, your axle path is gonna be more rearward in the beginning of the travel than it would be with a 29-inch wheel. And that rearward axle path gives us, anyway, a real consistent feeling from sag to mid-stroke, where the rear center isn't changing. So also with a 27.5 versus a 29-inch wheel, you can get the same gear ratio using a bigger chainring on a 27.5. It's almost exactly the same with a 2-tooth jump. So if you're using a 36 on a 27.5-inch wheel, that's almost the same gear ratio, almost exactly the same as using a 34 on a 29-inch wheel. And that bigger chainring gives you lower anti-squat and less pedal kick with the same gear ratio. So apples to apples comparison, you have better numbers out of a 27.5-inch rear wheel looking at the kinematics as well as what meets the eye with a 27.5-inch wheel. Okay, this video is not gonna be 10 minutes if I keep going this route. The front triangle is 60-61 aluminum. We chose that because it was easy to work with, really good strength to weight ratio, and let us make those small refinements along the way. If we were stuck with a carbon fiber mold, it just wouldn't really financially be possible to go back and refine it every time over the past 2 years that we were changing the frames. We did lock into the mold for the rear end. These points locked into carbon fiber still let us change the frame as much as we needed to where it mounts to the front end. So the rear end's pretty neutral, all these points being locked in. And we can move the main pivot, the rocker link where it mounts to the rocker to get any kinematic changes that we wanted to through the development process. The carbon fiber rear end is 800 grams lighter than the aluminum rear end we were using. And the alignment of all the pivots, the rear brake, the hub spacing is all perfect in carbon fiber. So there's a lot of benefits for making these frames repeatable and precise using carbon fiber. The links and hardware are all 70-75 T6 for all the non-welded parts on the bike. That offers the best strength to weight ratio. The bike uses a 250/75 shock, standard mounting hardware. That's the most common size for a downhill bike. The top mounting hardware is 30/8 millimeters. So if you wanted to use a bearing at the top where the link gets more rotation, you can, but you can also use standard 30/8 hardware if you don't want another bearing in your bike. The bottom's 20/8, another super common size. Bottom bracket's 83 millimeter threaded. The rear hub is 148/12 boost. We went for that in the beginning just because I just wanted less hub sizes in my garage. And with a 7-speed drivetrain on a downhill bike, you can run a 148 boost rear wheel, no problem. The hub flange is actually better on most hubs in 148 than the old 150 spacing DH. So the idea of being able to switch back and forth between your trail bike and your downhill bike in a pinch, or just having less proprietary wheel sets around, we're using 148/12 on the rear axle. The rear brake mount is post 200. We've been running 220 all year. There's plenty of clearance. You can fit a SRAM 200, Shimano 203. We've actually not needed to use any spacers to go to 203. It's only 1.5 millimeters difference, just the diameter of the rotor. It's been working for us, but you could use a little 1 millimeter spacer if you need to. And we just thought 200 post covered all of our bases, so it's the most adaptable for any rotor size you might need. The seat post is 31.6 and the seat post clamp is 38.1. Both are standard sizes. You won't have any problem finding those. The headset for the bike is ZS56 on the top and ZS62 on the bottom. We went to the 62 bottom cup because we wanted to offer a reach adjust headset without adding any axle to crown. Last year, we were using a straight ZS56, which is super common on downhill bikes. But to go more than 5 millimeters, we would have to put the bearing outside of the head tube, and that adds about 10 millimeters of stack height. Does a lot of geometry changes to the bike. And with ZS62, it's also a standard size, albeit it's not as common. I was able to buy at Cane Creek in stock a straight ZS62 cup that fit in this bike. And we can, with our custom cups that we'll offer in addition to the frames, go plus or minus 9 millimeters, keeping the bearing inside the frame. So that gives us 18 millimeters of range with reach without making any other modifications to the bike. I think that's a really handy feature for our downhill frames and should be able to get most people in the right size range. We have a medium size and large size frame, both proportionally scaling the reach and rear center. In the future, we'd love to offer more sizes, but with our reach adjust headset, we can go from 446 to 494 in 5 millimeter increments. And I believe that can get most of the people out there in a good spot for their downhill bike. All the cable routing for this bike is external. It's been important to us, especially for a rear brake. If you have a good bleed, if you have an issue with your frame, you can quickly change a brake and have one bled ready to go. You don't need to route it inside the frame. For someone doing a lot of frame swaps and a lot of work on the bike, I can appreciate a bike that's easy to work on, and external cable routing really helps with that. All the bearings we chose are common bearings that are easy to find. To start with, we're able to find them all on QBP, so any bike shop should have them or at least be able to get them. They're all enduro bearings. We'll throw them up on the screen now so you can see what our bearing sizes are. Yeah, they've all been really reliable with our real world testing. All right, hopping into the construction of the frame. We really focused on making these things easier to build. If they're easier to build, they're easier to build perfectly. The repeatability of that, especially going into production, is really important to us. We were 3D scanning every frame that we got along the way and keeping track of how accurate they were. Surprisingly, Frank was doing an awesome job, but scaling up to a larger batch of bikes, we wanted to make a lot of the things he was doing a little easier. So with these, we put a lot of complexity into the CNC parts of the frame. For example, this bottom bracket piece is one piece CNC'd from the bend in the down tube to the bottom bracket to the main pivot that also captures the shock mount, the ISCG tab, and if they're all in one piece, these points are located off the bottom bracket. So all of your suspension points are captured and exactly where we intended them to be. We raced with that all season and it proved to work really well. And in our production frames, we offer a little flip chip here to go from 27% to 30% progression. I've been racing with 30% all season. We can appreciate that other people have a preference to change their overall progression and leverage ratio, and that flip chip is a nice little feature on the bike that can customize it for each rider. We also learned that the tub that holds the shock created a little bit of a bathtub that held mud, and we made a nice window here for the bike to drain if you're washing your bike. Just little refinements that we learned along the way. Part of those 8 frames that we made, we can do things like that. The down tube is 2" by 0.65 wall, 6061 T6 aluminum. The top tube is 1¾ by 0.65 wall, and the seat tube is 1.5" by 0.83 wall. What's really nice about this frame is all the tubes are able to be straight. We avoided bending any tubes by putting that complexity in the CNC parts, as I said. The bend that's in the down tube was captured by that one-piece CNC part so that the down tube could be straight where it attaches there. The rocker pivot mount is a little corner joint between the top tube and the seat tube, so that can be welded in there to a straight top tube and seat tube, and not bending the tubes makes them stronger, and it eliminates one process along the way to make the bike, which gives a more repeatable and higher quality finished product. We use a small shock extender to flip the shock piggyback at a 90 degrees. That gives us more clearance to the down tube, so we don't need a bend or as much of a belly in the bike. We get the same clearance of an inline shock when we mount it with the piggyback on the side. And we kept the shock extender as short as possible. I know there's a concern for long shock extenders putting added stress on the bike, but with this one, the goal was just to make it do a 90. With the shock being able to rotate in 4 directions instead of just 2, it could be argued that it actually gives the shock a little more freedom and does a similar thing to what a spherical bearing could do to preserve side loads on your shock. It's super similar to the shock extender that an enduro or a demo uses. We just do it on the reservoir side. We wanted to mount the reservoir to the main frame because we wanted the heavy part of the shock not to be moving with the suspension. Okay, so geo of the bike, we'll throw the geo chart up on the screen now. I ride the large and the center position has a 485 reach. Again, with the headset, you can go plus or minus 9 millimeters or 5 millimeters from there. So you can be at 494 or 490, centered 485, 480, or 476. So it gives you several positions to adjust. The chainstay length static is 460. I found that that chainstay length gives a really good balance front to rear and allows you to weight the bike through your feet, not having to shift back and forth with your hands like some shorter chainstays do. Then on the medium frame, we basically just move all the suspension points forward in relation to the bottom bracket and reduce the top tube length a little bit to change the reach. So we can use the same link in rear end and just change the aluminum front triangle for the medium. The reach on that is 455 in center position. And again, you can go 9 or 5 plus or minus on the head tube to get the reach you want. And the chainstay length is 450 for the medium. The bottom bracket height is 342. The wheelbase on the large frame is 1312 millimeters. And the wheelbase on the medium is 1272 millimeters, based on a 52 mil offset fork at 602 axle to crown, which is what I ride. Everything else on the 2 frame sizes is the same. The BB height is 342, head angle is 63.3. Through all of our testing, we moved the kinematics around a little bit, but to be honest, it didn't change the geometry of the bike too much at all. Now I'll get into some kinematics.
Careful with what you say here because I know you and this could become an hour segment by itself.
Okay, we'll throw some of the kinematics up on the screen, some graphs while I'm talking about this. I guess the first thing would be the leverage ratio. I race it in the 30% position all year. It starts at 3.35 to 1 and ends at 2.35 to 1. It has a little bit more progression in the first half of the travel than the second half of the travel. And based on our data recording, that gave us a really supportive platform from SAG, but then let us use most of the travel when we really needed to. If we continued on the same trajectory, we weren't really using anything past 185, 190, even in those bigger hits when you wanted the bike to absorb. So that was dialed in over the past 2 years racing the bike. Then we also put a more linear setting. So we have progression setting more or less, and in the back position you get the 30%, which is what I race. In the front position you get a 27% rate change, which is a nice noticeable change that you can do without changing spring rates. Sometimes when the progression is so much, you end up having to change spring as well, and your wheel rate with a different spring doesn't make the change that you intended. So this is enough that it's noticeable, but not so much that you need to change springs. The leverage ratio in the more linear setting starts at 3.2 to 1 and ends at 2.3 to 1. The change in travel with the lower leverage goes from 205 to 201. So axle path is pretty interesting on this bike. It's somewhat of a mid-pivot design, higher main pivot than most bikes would use without an idler pulley. The axle path we could get out of that goes backwards 6 millimeters to around where SAG is, and then by the time you reach full travel, you come forwards 12 millimeters. Where that inflection point is, you go from SAG at 60 millimeters to 120 millimeters with the axle path only changing less than 2 millimeters. And in that range of travel is where you spend most of the time handling the bike in corners. The most time spent through the travel based on our data that you're riding the bike is in that SAG to 120 zone. It creates a very predictable feeling in corners when your rear center isn't changing as you're executing your turns. We paid the price for it with a little bit higher anti-squat and a little bit more pedal kick. I use an O-chain to combat that. The bike works well without it, but the O-chain has the same effect as it does on most bikes, where it gives a little bit less harsh of a feeling, takes the edge off some of the hits. Another thing to consider when you're looking at the higher anti-squat numbers for a downhill bike is that most of the time you're pedaling a downhill bike, you're sprinting it and you're standing up tall. So it changes your center of gravity, reducing that anti-squat number and puts it in a spot where it's actually pretty nice to have a stiffer bike as you're sprinting it. We have 180% anti-squat at peak, and it falls down pretty quick. As I said, standing up sprinting high anti-squat on a downhill bike isn't the worst thing. On a trail bike where you're sitting more of the time, the lower center of gravity, having to get traction while you're pedaling, it's more important. There's not really much need for traction while pedaling on a downhill bike. You just want that thing to be stiff enough to reduce pedal bob as you're powering to the finish line. Anti-rise on this bike starts at 70% and goes down to 60. That, for me, gives the suspension a supple feel under braking, but still loads the spring enough to where the geometry of the bike is predictable and you get what you need to while braking on a downhill track. In addition to just the frame, we're offering it with 3 shock options. I worked with Fox, which is my preferred shock choice, and also RockShox and Öhlins to give 3 choices for customers. This bike's marketed towards amateur racers, and I can appreciate that people have a preferred shock manufacturer, and if they wanted a specific shock, we at least wanted to make sure they were getting the best version of that shock for our frame. So I did all the test riding. Ancho and I used our data acquisition system on the bike to reach some numbers that we got from baselines racing throughout the season, and we worked with each one of those shock manufacturers to get those numbers that we wanted out of all 3 shocks. So the frame with a RockShox shock is $4,400 USD, frame with a Fox shock is $4,450, frame with an Öhlins shock is $4,650. In addition to choosing each shock, you'll be able to choose the spring rates for your weight. We'll have that on our website so that you can clearly see what weight range you're in and what spring rate you need. A nice thing about us being able to take pre-orders is to customize that spring rate and tune just for you, for your rider weight. It's almost like sending your suspension off to be tuned aftermarket for you, but you're getting it straight out of the box, bolted to the bike. I think it's a really nice service that we offer. I put a lot of hard work into developing those shock tunes, and I think the riders are gonna appreciate that when they are in a good spot to start with our frame. So we're taking pre-orders for the frame. With the pre-order, we're asking for a 50% deposit, whether you want the frame kit alone or a frame with a shock. And that deposit gives us the money to go and build your frame. We've gotten this whole project to here with my own savings, and to be able to produce a batch of frames would require some financial investment. And Logan and I can keep full control if we're able to use the money from pre-orders to build our first batch. When we open pre-orders, we have 100 manufacturing slots. You can choose your frame size, medium or large. You can choose the frame only or the 3 shock options. Our target is to deliver these by February 15th. That way riders can build them up before the season starts. We only have 100 manufacturing slots. Seems like we have a lot of interest, so if you're really interested in buying one, we recommend hopping on that pre-order as quickly as you can. As they're marketed towards amateur racers, we wanted to make sure that those riders get them before the season starts. That's a big priority, keeping it to an amount that we can deliver in February so that these guys can get them built up for their season starting in March. All the frames are built by Frank the Welder at his shop in Vermont. All the CNC parts and links are made at 5Dev in San Diego, and our carbon rear triangles are made by VIP Composites in Asia. Logan and I are personally assembling them all. We'll be pressing all the bearings in, bolting them together, packaging them, and shipping them out to you. Logan is running the entire website, customer service. Anything you need, you'll be dealing with us directly. Frames have a 5-year industry standard warranty. We back the products. We've machine tested them, we've real world tested them, and we believe in them. Our main target is to sell these in the US, but if you are international and you want a frame, we're willing to work with you, but please be aware that there's going to be VAT and import taxes. We're not well set up to do this. We'll happily put the invoice for your bike and ship it wherever you'd like, but please do some research to what import taxes you'll encounter when the frame arrives in your country. We're not responsible for that, and we don't want you guys to have any surprises. We're also in the US, so if you have a problem, it'll take us a little bit of time to help you out, but again, we're willing to do it if you guys really want to frame outside the country. All the deposits are fully refundable. If at any time you decide that you want to back out, we'll send you your money back, and the next person on the waiting list will get your spot in line. Thank you guys for supporting this project. I'm really excited to get this frame out to the public. Please let us know if you have any questions. I'll do my best to answer every one of them. And thanks for watching.